rapidly growing,
non-native tree species,
consuming,
alien tree species,
adapting,
exotic species.
they conquer.
Forest fire. Education is very important.
Invasive species.
Strong bark beetle attack.
Risk,
Alien or a non-native.
resistance, heat, timber market, ecosystem services, recreational use, pests,
Jeopardizing local economies.
perception, public, biodiversity, urban trees, resilience, future, climate change, global change.
And devastating entire ecosystems.
We are talking about Alp trees. That's an Interact Alpine Space funded project.
Welcome to the 12th episode of our Alp Trees podcast series. It's Tuesday, 5th of October 2021, and today we will talk about the migration of tree species in the Alpine space. May I introduce today's experts? It's Nicola Laporta from FEM Foundation Edmund Mach di San Michele all'Adige in Italy.
Hello.
Franz Essel from the Botany and Biodiversity Research Department from the University in Vienna.
Hello.
Mariana Westergren from the Slovenian Forestry Institute, Department for Forest Physiology and Genetics.
Hi everyone.
Janine Oettel and Katharina Lapin from the Federal Research and Training Center for Forests, Natural Hazards and Landscape in Vienna, Austria.
Hi. Hello. Welcome to our podcast on species migration in the Alpine space. Thank you very much, Petra, for introducing and moderating also this podcast. I'm looking very much forward to talk to you about a very hot topic currently. The migration of species is often discussed as a consequence of climate change, and it's very hard also as a limiting factor for the conservation for biodiversity in future. And there is still a lot of topics undiscovered, and I'm very grateful to have this wonderful expert with us today to talk about the species migration, particularly the migration of tree species in the Alpine space. In the Alp Trees project, we have discovered a large number of non-native tree species in the area. So over 500 different non-native tree species were growing in the area of the Alpine space, in cities, but also in forests. Most of them, around 50%, were from Asia, 39% are from North America, so they are really introduced from another continent by humans. But there is also a small number of non-native tree species which are native to other parts of Europe, and sometimes they were introduced, but sometimes they have migrated into this Alpine space. So this share includes about 17 species from the Balkans, 17 from Italy, and from other regions of the Mediterranean area.
The history of tree species migration goes back to the last ice age that ended approximately 11,000 years ago. In her work, Mariana Westergren tried to decipher ways of migration of different tree species.
So after the last ice age, trees started to migrate from the southern European peninsulas towards north. So they were going from the Iberian, from the Apennine, and from the Balkan Peninsula, slowly migrating towards north, meeting on their ways different populations, different species they were meeting and mixing their gene pools. And this is reflected today in the genetic composition of these tree species. So, for example, if we are looking at Norway spruce, that is a particular species because it survived in the southern peninsulas, but also further north. And this is reflected in the fact that the populations in the Alps belong to a different lineage than the Norway spruce populations in the north of Europe, so in the Scandinavia and also further towards the Russia. So this is something that a lot of work has been put in, and we know this information for quite a lot of species. And based on that, we also were able to establish how fast the species migrated after the last ice age. It was less than 1 kilometer per year. It's little. You have to think about it that this was in a time when the space was empty. There were no human settlements, no agriculture, so the trees were able to migrate freely the way they wanted to do. And migration is also important today. It's still happening. It's happening towards the north. It's happening up towards the mountaintops. And there will be a point when there will be no soil for the species. So they will need to stop, or maybe there will be smaller species, herbs and shrubs, preparing the soil for them. But once they reach the top of the mountain, then they will not have the place to go anywhere else. So if we want the trees and the tree populations to survive, they either have to migrate or they need to adapt based on their genetic diversity. Otherwise, of course, they will die. The population will die out and we will lose its gene pool. So these are migration and adaptation are the two mechanisms how the tree species can adapt. And it's the same for native tree species and non-native tree species. Now, this was information about how the migration worked in the past and how it's happening today in the native species. The mechanisms would apply also for non-native species, but the prerequisite is that these non-native tree species naturally regenerate. They would need to have offspring with how these offsprings move towards the north, and the non-native tree species would also migrate and change its distribution range. So if the non-native tree species is contained and we don't let it regenerate naturally, it will stay in the place that it is, and we will only be able to move it with seed or with seedlings, with our plantings.
Nicola, he's a very good observer of sites in the Alpine space. Nicola, can you maybe tell us a story about one species you have particularly observed moving from the southern part to the northern part, or any other migrational moves in Italy?
Thank you, Caterina, to give me the opportunity to participate to this podcast. Yes, I have observed actually several species moving, at least in the last 30, 40 years, from south to north of Italy, and of course in the Alpine space and northward. One that I follow particularly is Cupressus sempervirens, is an archaeophyte. Actually, in English, it's called Italian Cypress, but to be precise, it's not it's not Italian, actually. It seems that it's come from Anatolia, from Turkey. And this species was brought to the western part of Mediterranean long ago, probably even before the Romans, perhaps by Phoenicians or Etruscans, because also Etruscan is a special population in the old time of Italy that it seems was moving from the same part of Turkey. Why Etruscan? Because this species is particularly frequent in Tuscany, where the Etruscan had their settlements, and is very popular there, and is the tree of the landscape, actually. This tree, especially in the last 100 years, is moving northward. That means that there are more and more people planted this species in the Italian Alps, but also in the northern part of the Alpine space. I have seen many times new plantation of this species. Why? Because this species is not affected very much by the heavy cold of winter. It's very important along the big lakes in the Alps. We have made a sort of inventory in North Italy. It reached 800 meters above the sea level. So it can grow quite well in the hills, in the lower part of the mountains, especially for ornamental, of course, but also it's used for shelter because it's protected by the wind. And also it seems quite resistant to fire, this species. The quality of the wood is excellent. Even in Germany, I have seen many nurseries, they are selling this tree in Germany, in Austria, and of course in France. But in France, you know, you have the Mediterranean climate and it's different, but also in Hungary, also in some people, they try even to cultivate in Estonian, I think.
So, Nicola, my question would be also, I mean, maybe for the listeners, it sounds like tree species migration is always linked to human activity. Or do you know about tree species which might also migrate without humans' help?
Most of them, this species is connected with human help, is a human driven. But there are cases where it's grown naturally. For example, in the old times in North Italy, it was planted by some people to make part of the very old plains.
Thank you, Nicola. And it sounds like climate plays quite an important role when it comes to the distribution of species and also the migration of species. And I'm very happy to have here Franz with us, who is very known for his research on climate change and biodiversity, and also species migration. And maybe, Franz, you can explain us a little bit better how climate change and species migration is linked.
We humans, or basically the Earth we're living on, we are entering a phase where it's quite likely, unfortunately, that there will be strong changes to many of the environmental conditions species have to cope with. And climate is, of course, a very, very critical one. In forests of the future, changes of species, tree species occurrences in particular, will be the compound result of natural forces, like climate change and human activities. And in many cases, human activities will actually overwhelm natural range shifts, because tree species have a long life cycle, often relatively small dispersal distances, which translates in relatively slow adaptation potential to climate change. And given the extremely fast projected climate change we will likely have to face in the next decades, it's quite unlikely that any tree species has the potential to move across landscapes rather rapidly or as rapid as climate is changing. So in fact, it will mostly be driven by human activities, especially if it comes to, let's say, long distance changes of species distributions in forests.
In our strategy, which we developed for non-native tree species in the Alpine Space, we of course tackle this, how species can be supported or shouldn't be supported in case of their invasiveness, as you have heard in the previous podcast episode. We know that species migration, and also due to this availability of habitats and climate, might not only affect tree species, but also a lot of other organisms, which are very crucial to the overall forest biodiversity. There is, of course, methods and ways how to increase habitat connectivity and what are the barriers of it. Janine, you were focusing very much on availability of different habitats. Maybe you can explain what this actually means and what are the actions taken in forest conservation to increase the habitat connectivity.
Habitat connectivity itself is defined as the degree to which a landscape facilitates or also impedes species movement and other ecological processes, such as the seed dispersal. There are several features of connectivity which we have to be aware of, or which in total combine the topic connectivity, which is relating to the structural connectivity. This is the landscape composition in terms of the distance between the habitats, the size of the different habitats, and how they are arranged. And the second part is the functional connectivity, which refers to how the habitat looks like. So how is it structured? And talking about forests, there are different structural components we can define relating to microhabitats, or for example, deadwood that is available in a forest for many, many different species. And I think in the future, so the connectedness of the landscape will be very species specific, or at least specific on the basis of functional groups. Coming back to the trees and the tree species, so there will be one most important aspect, how relating to the distances in terms of seed dispersal.
The tree species and the different tree populations within the species, because that's what usually it's a population that migrates, and then with that we move also the species range. The species do that either through seed, and this is a very slow rate of migration because it only goes as far as the seed can travel from the tree. Another pathway is through pollen, and when pollen is released into the wind, it travels further. Maybe a small fraction of that pollen will be viable when it falls down, and it will infuse the gene pool of this original population into a population further away from it. Now, it doesn't matter if it's north, south, east, west, and we can look and decipher how this is happening with molecular markers. It will infuse a part of the gene pool into another population, and with that way, we also get a migration of a tree population.
There are also limits to adaptation. And I'm not fully sure if many of the people working in the forestry sector are actually fully aware of these limits. One key limit is the longevity of trees combined with the uncertainty of climate change. Any tree species you plant on a given place today will stay there for the next 70 to 100 years before it's ripe for harvesting from a forestry perspective, which means you may face very, very different trajectories of climate change in this time period. And it's very hard to predict how this will unfold because it depends also on many human decisions, like how strongly we respond to climate change, but also on many unknowns. So any decision of planting tree species today on a place is highly uncertain. The stronger climate change will be, the higher the uncertainty. This is one of the limits which can, in my opinion, be not overcome in many situations. And thus, I think it's really imperative also from the forestry sector to really understand the huge threat of a severe climate change to their business in the end, because there's very little potential to mitigate effectively the impacts of climate change on tree species compositions in forests.
Thank you for describing this again. Nicola, you can give an example for a tree species. How does it actually would happen if a species would naturally migrate? Because we heard already about how tree species is placed in a new area through human actions, but how would it look like if a tree species migrates by its own means, and what does it need to migrate?
Of course, it requires a very strong capacity of regenerate. So production of seeds and quite a long distance of seed flying. Of course, available land where to germinate and to grow up. Some tree species are not so strong in migration, and so it's possible to help them to migrate and colonize new places.
In the ecological literature, there are different terms that are used for moving species to other places for specific purposes. Assisted migration, which is one of these terms, means that species are moved to other places because of conservation concerns. So this should be highly threatened species. There should also be sound evidence that the species have better prospects under climate change at different sites where they're not occurring yet compared to the historic native range. There are many issues that have to be taken into account, and also quite a number of risks, and also failure is often quite likely in such situations. But the key defining aspect is it has to be done because of conservation concerns after risk assessment and taking into account the full range of risks. That's also as put forward by the IUCN in its guidelines by International Union of Conservation. Moving species, for instance, for economic reasons, or introducing species for economic reasons or any other reason, is not assisted migration, particularly if it's not being done in the framework that's required, like by IUCN guidelines, full risk assessment, and so on and so on.
But there are nuances of assisted migration. So when we are really speaking about assisted migration, that would be when we are moving a tree species from America to Europe. That's assisted migration. But then it's always involves long distance travel of seed and seedlings. Also, assisted migration would be if we move tree species that is only present, for example, in the Apennine Peninsula, and we would move it further north, let's say to Switzerland, where this species doesn't exist now. When we are moving material within the species distribution range, then we are talking about assisted translocation. And then we would move a population, for example, that is south, and we would move it further up north to get the pre-adapted genes, let's say to drought. We would move it north to infuse those genes into a more northern population, hoping that this will make it more resilient to climate change.
We have experience in Alpine Space of Italy for the black pine. Most of the place where black pine is growing is not natural in Italy, and the black pine is growing more and more uphill, bringing with him also problems. For example, the processor running moth, the Taumetocarpa pitiocampa. It grows quite well in poor soil, and it can compete with the local native trees. But this is valid for the black pine. other pines like strobus, like radiata we have, but is just human driven. It's not natural migration. So that's my experience.
Thank you, Nicola. Migration of species often includes these keywords of reproduction and the transfer of genetic material, and also like keeping up the genetic diversity of species and tree species. So here again, we had quite vivid discussions in our workshops with different foresters who have observed changes due to climate change, and they're aware that something needs to happen in their forest to maintain also the tree species benefits and the ecosystem services. And very often the discussion is on the diversity of tree species, especially on the genetic diversity within the same species groups and the maintenance of diversity through adapted genetic material, for example. Is it realistic to support species migration of native tree species and those of the surrounding areas for the migration? Is there some success stories you know about? Or are we failing on this?
In America, they have made several experiences, in Canada especially, of assisted migration, especially with spruce. You have more chance to succeed when you have many populations of the same species growing in different kind of climates. So you can select one that is more potentially adaptable to the new site. When you have a very limited gene pool, then you cannot do very much, I think, with this. It's the case of radiata pine, for example, that is very limited the natural area, even though it's growing like hell in the southern hemisphere and also in northern hemisphere. But for many other species like Norway spruce or Scotch pine, you have a huge amount of populations, so you can select the best one to grow in new area, in a colonized new area, to help with assisted migration. Yeah.
One of the fundamental limits for climate change adaptation in forest management is that planting trees on a given place today, facing uncertain climate and facing an uncertain velocity and also scale of climate change on a certain place for the decades to come, implies that most likely many species one is planting today because the climate is suitable for them, and they may even cope with a moderately warm and drier climate, for instance. This does not necessarily mean that they will be able to cope with the climate we will maybe have at the same place in 50, 70, or 100 years, but it's a lifetime of a tree individual on a place before it's ripe for harvesting from a forestry perspective. This means maybe many tree species will not survive until the full age for forestry harvest. And this most likely will be a phenomenon that's becoming more and more severe and widespread for many species, the more severe climate change will be, because that implies rapid changes of fundamental climatic characteristics like temperature or precipitation regimes. And that implies forestry should really be one of the pressure groups actually urging also society for ambitious climate change policy in their own interest.
We have also provided our listeners with like visualizations of climate change scenarios and how different tree species behave in future. And I can agree with you, Franz, that the future looks quite alarming. And that very few tree species have a chance also really to adapt in such a short time to those changes. It's not only the temperature increase, but also the decrease of precipitation. You're invited also to look at our risk maps, which you find on the Alptrees homepage, where you can observe how different tree species will behave in future. Non-native or native, both are having real struggles in the alpine space. There is for sure many more threats to species who live in forests, apart, of course, from the tree species, who might suffer not only from the climatic changes, but also from fragmentation and forest fragmentation. It's a quite complex topic to describe species migration and also the role of non-native tree species in this discussion. I think this podcast have shown how quickly we can slip from discussing non-native tree species, which are introduced from other continents, to those native tree species or native species in general, which are migrating because they are looking for better places to reproduce and to maintain their populations. So here, I think for the future, at least from my side, I would hope that we would be more careful when using different terms, when talking to the public, and also maybe exploring all sides of biodiversity in all different kinds of species. And we have discussed now also that modeling can be a quite nice approach to predict or project probabilities of species occurrences under different circumstances. And I'm very grateful that we had a chance to at least cut all those topics for at least a second in this podcast. Do you want to have a final statement round?
Even with ambitious climate mitigation actions, a certain amount of climate changes cannot be avoided anymore. And this will translate to changing climatic conditions on basically every place on the Earth. And species will partly respond to this by, actually trying to track the changing climate more or less efficiently. That means in practice that species will, if they're mobile, will move across landscapes in many cases. And for forests, this will be compounded by human activities even more pronouncedly, because forests, at least in Europe, mostly are used by humans. That includes plantation of new trees. And this will, in the future, probably also be a significant factor that actually will determine which tree species will grow on which places. I would expect that many foresters will take into account how likely future climates may look like in forests they are managing.
I really want to go into practice now because we still have very little data. So I would like to ask people when they are actually planting, whatever, if it's a native species, if we are talking about non-native species, whenever you source seed or take seed from somewhere else, not locally, either that would be from far away or from maybe only 50 kilometers away, and then you plant it. Please keep records on that, because this will be a very valuable source of information for the future, and we will know what kind of provenances, what kind of species will actually grow in a given place, from where we should source them. And probably a lot will fail, but the ones that stay and thrive, these are our winners, and these are the ones that we have to keep thinking about in the future. And, it goes for non-native tree species and it goes for native species as well.
Thank you very much for all the participants to join us today, to Janine, Franz, and Nicola, and also to Petra. There will be for sure more research coming up from these amazing scientists in the near future, and good luck for all your work. And thank you very much for joining us to this podcast.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation.
Thank you.
I hope it had some discussion in future. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Bye.